Okay, now we unpack it a bit more, get deeper into the psychology aspect, and look at the whole concept of the self-sadism. Because as a matter of fact, as I said before, crime in the physical outplaying of violence and sadism, as it's normally called, has been well documented. But the worst crimes are done to the self, and they're not documented. We're very, very young in understanding this whole concept of self-sadism, or masochism as it's often called. Don Miguel in the Four Agreements says, in your whole life, nobody has ever abused you more than you have abused yourself. And the limit of your self-abuse is exactly the limit you will tolerate from someone else. If someone else abuses you a little more than you abuse yourself, you will probably walk away from that person. But if someone abuses you a little less than you abuse yourself, you'll probably stay in the relationship and tolerate it endlessly. So again, we ask, when you think about yourself, are your thoughts positive or negative, creative or destructive, loving or violent? You can look it up. Psychophobia, R.D. Laing. Psychophobia, phobia of your own mind. Can you believe it? The fear of our own thinking process. Each year in the UK, more than 24,000 teenagers are admitted to hospital after deliberately harming themselves, but only a small proportion, around 13%, of self-harm episodes are thought to result in a hospital visit. So it's on the increase. Laing says that the only death we recognize is biological death. And in the following talk, we will be looking very deeply at the nature and dynamics of what I refer to as the self-murdered person. They are the world's greatest threat, whether they're on the corporate level or governmental level or right in the bed next to you. So as you said, the fancy word for it is masochism, but I refer to it as self-sadism, and it is a bit of a bizarre concept because we don't normally think of people walking around, being dead, because they're walking around. But the fact of the matter is that you can psychologically be dead, self-murdered. How can that person do any good in the world? They create havoc wherever they go. And we can't expect the world to be good or pleasant or civilization to move forward until every shred of the self-sadism is erased. So fixing things on a governmental level is only a small, small part of the action that's required. We have to deal with this inner self-sadism, the violence we commit to ourselves on a daily, even momentary basis. When all of that stops, then and only then is the person capable of going out and affecting true change in the world. Gurdjieff, the mystic, said, it happens fairly often that essence dies in a man, while his personality and his body are still alive. If you take a good hard look around, you'll see that he was right. Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher, said, the biggest danger, that of losing oneself, can pass off in the world as quietly as if it were nothing. Look at that. And then this character is running around, sitting on boards, affecting change, getting married, having kids. Nathaniel Branden, in the book The Disowned Self, says that nothing is easier than for men to practice self-renunciation. They do it every day. It is not a difficult feat or a moral achievement. It is a disease. Not selfishness, but the absence of self. Not self-esteem, but self-alienation. Makes possible the barbaric cruelty that men practice against one another. Now, as we said, the investigation, something interesting about the mind, is that when you try to do investigation of your own self, it's not easy. Partly because of these defenses, partly because of the monitoring of the superego. So the very action of trying to observe yourself is difficult. It comes with complications. Partly the cacophony, right, created by our interactions with the Mitwelt and the Umwelt also block it out. The noise and cacophony of the external world and our entanglement in those realms often the racket of it, you see, blots out the other dialogue. Remember that Monty Python sketch where they're all sitting in the boardroom asking why people don't get enlightened? And one character reads from a paper and says, we've discovered that it's because people become, and just as he's about to say distracted, he gets distracted and sees this skyscraper crashing through the window. Very, very good point, though. Alan Watts says it, nothing so eludes conscious inspection as consciousness itself. This is why the root of consciousness has been called, paradoxically, the unconscious. And we alluded a little bit to why that division took place is because a lot of it is the repression of the trauma. The divide and the rise of the ego is to section off that part of us that is the ancestral mind, that it's too raw a nerve, it's too soon in the game of history for us to visit that pain of what happened ancestrally through the cataclysms and traumas. And I also must add, I believe, the genetic interference. And Jung says that to find out what is truly individual in ourselves, profound reflection is needed. And suddenly we realize how uncommonly difficult the discovery of individuality is. And unfortunately, that is one of those skills that is actually being lost. Children today who are coming through the schools don't even have the hardwiring for that kind of insight. That's how bad things are. They wouldn't know what you were talking about. The simple critical skills, the introspective skills that were quite natural to people in the past are now becoming extinct. It's all stages on the way. Now, Fromm says that Freud found that if the analyst touched on repressed material, the patient would resist his therapeutic approach. This is not a matter of conscious unwillingness on part of the patient, or of dishonesty, or of secretiveness. He's defending himself against the discovery of the unconscious material without being aware either of the material or of his resistance. The patient can turn away from the sensitive topic and talk about something else. He can feel sleepy and tired. He can find a reason not to come to the interview. Or he can become very angry against the analyst and find some reason to quit the analysis. Projection, right? All these defenses. In other words, what's happening is we're hiding from ourselves. Theodore Reich says that the ego has built mighty defenses against the forbidden impulses that drive and push to gain some measure of expression. They are pressed into oblivion, into the dark abyss of rejected and condemned emotions and thoughts. They are disavowed, banned, and outlawed, and live in the netherworld never to be mentioned. In panic fear of their power, man has rolled obstacles as strong as the rock of Gibraltar before the door to prevent their return. They betray themselves nevertheless and give notice of their subterranean existence and activity in little unexpected signs, words, and gestures. They give themselves away in spite of shame and fear. Remember I said the imperial self isn't going anywhere? You can't kill it. You can only cage it, but it's not going to die. It's not going to go away. R.D. Laing was spot on, says Jeremy Griffiths, when he said that humans live with 50 feet of solid concrete between themselves and the true world of their soul. Scott Peck, even, in his book People of the Lie, said that a man fights for a self that is not a true self. It's only a shell, dependent on abstractions that do not serve life itself, but rather its concealment. Remember the persona? You immersing yourself in the Mitwelt is to actually lose your soul. You lose the very thing you were trying to fight and maintain. And William Barrett, he says that so long as we remain in the womb of this externalized and public existence, we're spared the terror and the dignity of becoming a self. So there he's saying, you're negating the anxiety that is the legitimate and positive anxiety that comes with these rites of passage. And it's happening more and more in society, this phenomenon. The schizoid person feels existentially unlovable. They have no right to take up space on the planet. An irrational inner critic, perhaps a vicious internalized voice of mother or father, tells them that they're hopelessly at fault in some way. Clumsy, ugly, awkward, or stupid. Nothing but trouble. These negative conclusions are unshakable. That's in the extreme forms of the schizophrenic type. And Christopher Lasch says that 20th century peoples have erected so many psychological barriers against strong emotion and have invested those defenses with so much energy derived from forbidden impulse that they can no longer remember what it feels like to be inundated by desire. They tend rather to be consumed with rage, which derives from defense against desire and gives rise in turn to new defenses against rage itself. Outwardly bland, submissive, and sociable, they seethe with an inner anger for which a dense, overpopulated, bureaucratic society can devise few legitimate outlets. But they're going to start. They're working on it. Theodore Reich says that one of the most important measures of civilization to make that aggressiveness harmless can be studied in the evolution of the individual. It will be turned inside, introjected, and taken over by that part of the ego called the superego that now, in the form of conscience, exercises aggressiveness against the ego. And he's talking about the superego's totalitarianism, psychic totalitarianism. The tension between the strict superego and the subordinate ego is called a sense of guilt, and it manifests itself in the need for punishment. Now, whence does this sense of guilt come, he asks. In the first stage can be best designated as a dread of losing love. Obviously, one of the first anxieties is not just the physical act of being born, but the idea that you might be separate, that separation from the mother. But more than that, it's the bad deed is one that, when discovered, would be followed by the loss of love. So the child is very innocent. It doesn't realize that if it breaks a window or breaks a vase or does something, pulls the cat's tail or whatever, it doesn't realize, in its mind, it is really dealing with the fact that that single act might lose it completely, the sustenance and love and succor of the parent. Look how powerful the parent is. And the parent will manipulate this as well. The tyrannical parents manipulate that fact. That's why all this beration to the child, you're just this and you're just that and you're going to get a spanking, I'm going to tell dad when he comes home and all the rest of it. Working on the child's fear of losing that love. And of course it's even more extreme in certain cases. Now at this state, the sense of guilt is still a social anxiety. It will remain that in its core. That means anxiety that the father or mother and later the community will disapprove of and punish the misdoer. As a parent can exploit that, so can Big Brother. Now, feelings of guilt occur after one has committed a forbidden deed. The sense of guilt that is later developed is often unconscious and sometimes perceived only as some kind of vague anxiety or uneasiness, for instance, in many obsessional cases. It is in its later phases anxiety towards the superego, so to speak, dread of the superego. We analysts have been inclined to assume that any kind of thwarted instinctual gratification results in the heightening of a sense of guilt. Freud's newest insights convinced him that this is valid only for the aggressive instincts. You feel guilty when you feel a welling up of aggression. But watch this. In other words, the origin of guilt feelings is in the area of aggressive instincts. Now, we're led to the assumption that guilt feeling is generated exclusively by aggression and not by any other drives. If this is correct, we can expect that the same origin and character will be found in the sense of guilt met with in the evolution of mankind. Religion, particularly Christianity, traces the guilt feeling of man back to the original sin. Man's sin against God, there you have guilt, which is conceived as sexual transgression to the weakness of the flesh or to sensual desire or whatever. Our whole civilization, including our education, is under the spell of this view. It is common to the moralists, theologians, and philosophers to regard sexuality as the root of man's criminality and sinfulness, as well as to the educators and psychologists, including psychoanalysts, who hope that freedom from sexual suppression will change man and remove the greatest obstacle in our civilization. This writer is of the opinion that both groups are mistaken and believes that also the guilt feelings of mankind have their roots in aggression and violence. Unconscious elements were originally made unconscious because such thoughts and impulses were not tolerated by parents and teachers in earlier years, and continued recognition of them would be anxiety-provoking. In order to defend the ego against anxiety, resistances are built up against the recognition of these unconscious impulses, which Reich is saying the most important one is aggression, or anger, right? But if the child's aggression is legitimate, which it often is, at being controlled, at being manipulated, at being thrown hither and thither, having its mental, all this catch-22 and control play that goes on, the whole drama, right? That child's response that Reich is talking about but didn't mention could be a legitimate expression against being controlled. So the dynamic then is that when natural and perfectly legitimate anger and aggression rises up, as he said, it gets interjected. Now, women interject more, men project. Hence bulimia and anorexia and many of the other syndromes that women suffer, even in fact bad eyesight. It's all related to the interjection of anger. But what he forgot to say is that if it's legitimate, then look at the mess that you're in. You're guilty over a natural expression. And this then becomes a syndrome that just keeps on spiraling out of control. You end up with a big Cheshire grin, as everything's all right. Or you try to ascribe, oh yeah, I was a bad kid, I can understand what they did. And you go through all of these justifications. Now, technically, guilt is over physical misdemeanors. He mentioned shame, and that's different. Shame is over something, we'll have to get to that later, but let's just stick with that. So the instincts that arise in the child, he's in a terribly compromised situation. And this is working higher up the fractal as well. This is how Big Brother is also working. You have the guilt over natural instincts that should be allowed to be communicated. And then you interject that anger towards yourself. It's a terrible syndrome. Well, the justifications. I've been treated horribly by you, so now I'm just going to do the same to you. This is one of the outpourings of it. By the time the kid is 15, he's acting this out. Or it's paranoia and persecution complex. Everybody's out to get me. Yeah, well, they are. From a child's point of view, that's perfectly rational. Or the masochism, I expect to be treated badly. I've never known anything else. Go and ask Aboriginals, go and ask Native American Indians. They're all suffering from this syndrome. They've been treated like dogs from the day they went. What do you expect them to be later on? They have to take the alcohol to suppress the aggression. Legitimate aggression by being treated like dogs. This can happen in the home, let alone in a culture. Then the egomaniacal, narcissistic, pathological aspect. I'll stand up for myself. Nobody else cared or loved me. But he's not. The problem is that they're not talking about the true imperial self. The narcissist is caught in a trap because he's only speaking about the pseudo-self when he says he's out for number one. That's why it's another cul-de-sac, a dead end. He won't get anywhere with that. Then you have the negation. I don't need this love nonsense. Aggression is good. It's a rat race. Survival. There's another syndrome, another kind of human being. Or strength and power important. Must dominate. Virtue is merely convention. You know, the sort of I say Nietzsche, but Nietzsche's been so drastically mistranslated that I have to put this in brackets. But that would be considered the quote-unquote Nietzschean point of view. And along with it, the people who are walking around saying that guilt and remorse is for suckers. Because remember, it was the superego that was doing the job. And if the superego can crack, the superego is not, we've been talking about how powerful it is, it can also crack. There's certain periods in life and also in the chronology of a human being where the superego is relatively weak and can crack down the middle and become faulty. And when that happens, the conscience is no longer working at all, as it is in many of these psychopaths. So and even in today, when we're talking about modern concepts of freedom, it's the kind of freedom that has no virtue or morals, like Fromm was saying earlier on. If you've murdered yourself, like we said in the beginning, what do you care about anybody else? Now, Eric Fromm says that the intensely destructive person will show a front of kindliness, courtesy, love of family, of children, of animals. He'll speak about his ideals and his good intentions. But not only this, there's hardly a man who is utterly devoid of any kindness or any good intention. If he were, he would be on the verge of insanity. Hence, as long as one believes that evil men wear horns, one will not discover an evil man. And in the psychic vampirism talk, we're going to be able to come out to the other end of that knowing 100% how to spot them instantly. And that is going to help the world move forward. As a matter of fact, these people, in that talk, you'll discover that there's actually a term for them, a psychological term. It's called constitutional psychological inferiors. They're actually diagnosable, those people without conscience. And we have to develop that skill to be able to see them as such. Well, I thought the word inferior is never to be used. That's one of those words that's just taboo. Oh, is it? You're surrounded by them. You're voting for them. You're hiring them at work. You may have been given birth by a couple of them. You might be sleeping beside one. And so it's Time we found out. And there ain't no meter you can pull out and go, hey honey, hang on a minute, plug you in here. Shit. It doesn't work like that, I'm afraid. There's no physical meter. There is a meter, and it's called intuition. It's called rational ability. Well, you see, the thing is that this terrible paradox again, the idea that aggression is rooted in the true self-seeking expression. And a society that just can't handle it. So the women interject, the men project. But you see, the thing is, even Freud would admit, don't expect that repression to just disappear. That which is repressed, that anger is boiling inside and is going to come out in war and in violence and in family feuds and whatever else. It'll always find a way out. George P. Marsh says that man is everywhere a disturbing agent. Wherever he plants his foot, the harmonies of nature are turned to discords. Nature is the self. Self is nature. If you have self-sadism against the self, of course you're going to act in an ecocidal manner. Osho, the mystic, said that your whole idea about yourself is borrowed from those who have no idea who they are themselves, seeking guidance from the misguided. Edward Young, the English poet, said that we're born as originals and die as copies. Gruen says the source of aggression and destructiveness lies in our culture, not the individual. Remember, superego, shadow, superego. And everything that reinforces the fragmentation of our personality and closes off access to our inner world contributes to the creation and growth of those destructive drives. And didn't we say that the superego, being the representative of the boss hogs, as the suppression increases, the repression increases. So this is why I cannot, for the life of me, leave consciousness at the door in all of this conspiratorial research. It's impossible. They go together. They're absolutely intimately linked. And Ayn Rand says that man is the only living species that has the power to act as his own destroyer. And that is the way he has acted throughout most of history. Right? Cain and Abel. Creation's only happened and one of them is already a murderer. And the God, if you read the Bible, wasn't much better. Michael Staub says that Harvard psychiatrist Robert Coles went so far as to speculate in 1967 that there would never be an end to mental illness due to the advance in medical research. Because mental illness, and he himself put the words in quotation marks, was a social problem involving the family, the nursery, the neighborhood, the nation, and its economic and political conditions. To treat the sickness of the individual, psychiatrists had first to concede the sickness in society, which they're not doing. Only a group called the Post-Freudians, and then that group we discussed, the existential psychologists. And most of them are unheard of. Anna Freud created a neo-Freudian school where they put the entire focus on the superego. Fantastic research there. And they shifted their entire understanding of pathology. During Freud's time, it was thought that men went insane or schizophrenic or had hallucinations because of the id, right, the unconscious, bleeding over its protein content, its demonic stuff, into and flooding the ego. This was the diagnosis of insanity. By the time that Freud had died and his daughter took over, they realized, no, that is only in very rare cases. It is the superego chipping away and damaging the ego. And the whole movement changed, and it was actually called ego psychology. So if you look up on the web, ego psychology, Anna Freud, this is where they go. Major, major critics of our society. That's why you haven't heard of her. That's why you haven't heard of Otto Binswanger and Otto Rank. Ludwig Binswanger and Otto Rank and the others in that school. Or when you do hear them, it's imbeciles who don't understand anything about psychology. Important quote from Hillman, because he's never letting us forget the history. Archaeology supports the view that warfare is a development of only the last 10,000 years. There's that trauma point that I insist upon also has to be taken into consideration, the prehistoric origins of all of this. James Waller says that throughout human history, social conflict is ubiquitous. Wars erupt naturally everywhere humans are present. Since the Napoleonic Wars, we've fought an average of 6 international wars and 6 civil wars per decade. Even God just took one day off from all the slaughter he was involved in. An average of 3 highly fatality struggles have been in action somewhere in the world at any moment since 1900. The 4 decades after the end of World War II saw 150 wars and only 26 days of world peace. And that doesn't include the innumerable internal wars and police actions. There's actually a book called Death by Government. Get it? It shows, the writer of that book said, Rummel, he proves that governments slaughter more of their own people than any external adversary. Absolutely. The statistics are there. Buried in the midst of all of our progress in the 20th century are well over 100 million persons who've met a violent death at the hands of their fellow human beings. That is more than 5 times the number from the 19th century and more than 10 times the number from the 18th century. So things are getting worse. So now we look at, so after all, posthumanism involves the technological assault. That's a key part of it. We've looked at some of the psychological. It's only fair to look a little deeper at some of the technology. And again, not bashing science in the least. It's a total look at scientism. Scientism, just in the same way that when you look at the institutions of religion, you're not necessarily making a comment about individual believers in deity or God. So in the same way when you're looking at science, we can't fault the creations of science. But it's the ideology behind the science, the trickle down from upstairs, and some of the mysteria they believe in. Because as a matter of fact, I think that probably the greatest critique that one could have on the scientism is their fundamental misunderstanding of that connection between psychic and physical energy, the microcosm and the macrocosm. And that comes out of this whole Cartesian view that we can't go into, but I've gone into in other work like the Disciples of the Mysterium, where we explore that view. But Theodore Roszak explains the basic ideology and their concept that you have to fix their imperfections. He says the astronautical image of man, and it is nothing but the quintessence of urban industrial society's pursuit of the wholly controlled, wholly artificial environment, amounts to a spiritual revolution. This is man as he has never lived before. It draws the line through human history that almost assumes the dimensions of an evolutionary turning point. So it has been identified by Teilhard de Chardin, a Jesuit by the way, who has given us the concept of the noosphere, a level of existence that is to be permanently dominated by human intellect and planning, and which our species must now adapt if it is to fulfill its destiny. See, so the ideology that man is imperfect, a change is required, an evolutionary turning point in their scheme of things. They're bloody